Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. Today, it's a big day. It's our 50th episode. Thank you for listening and watching.
Thank you, Gideon. That's incredible applause.
Packed audience went crazy. No, but it is a big episode today because we first of all look at the wreckage left behind by the High Court in its decision yesterday to create an entirely new category of Australian. We also look at the collapse of George Calombaris' chain of restaurants and what that means for the industry and unions and everything else. And we also unpack the first faltering steps towards legalising digital currency that were taken at Davos. Don't forget, Looking Forward is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. If you're not already a member, please do go to ipa.org.au and see how you can join, donate, or just generally get around our research. Today, our closing books and culture segment has some great works of freedom. We're going to be looking at a book by Milton Friedman and also a collection of classic works by Wilhelm Ropke. Having butchered that German, I'll leave Kurt to clean up the mess. Also, the addictive soap opera Succession, which everyone seems to be, except me, seems to be talking about, and a long essay by David Brooks in The Atlantic on the collapse of the nuclear family. But it is time now to introduce our panellists. I'm Scott Hargreaves, editor of the IPA Review. Introducing, first of all, my co-host from RMIT University, Dr. Chris Berg.
Thank you, Scott. Happy 50th.
Yes, happy 50th. Is this our golden...
It's our golden anniversary. I had to Google that.
Oh, there you go.
It is cute.
Josh, do we have a cake? No, we'll do that later. Also, Kurt Wallace, research fellow and our ambassador of Austrian economics at the IPA.
Thanks for having me on.
Great to have you. And Gideon Rozner, Director of Policy. Good to have you here as we pick... You are actually a lawyer, aren't you?
In many moons ago in a past life.
I think that leaves you
technically
well qualified to talk about the High Court judgment. You did articles, though, didn't you?
I practiced for 3 years, yeah. It was my personal Vietnam. I'm glad to get out of it. But I did do my time.
PTSD. Tell us about the High Court, Chris.
Absolutely. So the High Court ruling actually was released yesterday in Love v Australia, which also brought in Toms v Australia. The story is this. So there were two men who've been facing deportation under the Australian Migration Act's character tests. They both committed separate violent assaults. They'd both been born they both were born overseas. One of them was born in New Zealand and one of them was born in Papua New Guinea. But they've lived most of their lives in Australia and yet had not obtained Australian citizenship. Yet they also had both of them Australian Indigenous descent. So the High Court was asked to make a ruling on whether they could be deported. And the High Court has determined that under the Australian Constitution, people with Aboriginal Australian descent cannot be considered aliens under the Constitution. So the idea is that if they have Indigenous heritage, regardless of whether they are Australian citizens or not, they somehow belong to the country, and the Constitution, or at least the High Court, has decided to recognise them as belonging to Australia. And I think there's a lot to talk about here, and I use that word belonging quite carefully because that's the word they use. But Gideon, why don't I throw first, just for your take on this, I think, rather extraordinary decision?
Yeah. Yesterday we, via press release written by the very esteemed Morgan Berg, called this the most radical act of judicial activism in the history of the Commonwealth, and I think that is absolutely correct. This is, not only is it radical, not only is it extreme, not only is it out of whack with what the community would expect out of Australian citizenship and sovereignty and so on, but it's actually an extreme, the supporting judgments are actually extremely wacky and poorly written. They seem to invoke what you could almost call voodoo jurisprudence. And I'll take this whopper of a sentence by Justice Nettle. Cases such as Singh authority appear to imply that a person can be classified as an alien where he or she was born abroad or is a foreign citizen. But intuitively, that conclusion appears to be at odds with the growing recognition of Aboriginal peoples as the original inhabitants of Australia and the ubiquity of Australian dual citizens. It is therefore necessary to stop and inquire and applying the received technique to re-examine the essentials of alienage and the nature of an Aboriginal person's relationship of the Australian polity to ascertain whether in truth upon the correct analysis of the situation. Now, those quotes are all from a couple of speeches by Owen Dixon. They're actually not from any judges or any authorities. Owen Dixon was a great judge, but it's not exactly the most direct authority you could use in case law. Later on, he throws in bits of...
which judge is this?
Justice Nettle.
Nettle.
Later on, he throws in bits of international law, going back to the theories about the conquistadors, back when Spain was invaded back in the day. So... really, I mean, and this joke's been made 100 times on Twitter and all sorts of other places, but it really is a case of Dennis Denuto from the castle. You know, it's Mabo, it's Owen Dixon, it's international law, it's the vibe, man. It's just the vibe. That is the and I guess I should go back a step and explain where what the legal basis of this decision is.
Can I just one more scene setter before we dive further into the judgment? And we've all this is the first draft of history here because we did our best to read it last night.
I like to think that every episode is a history-making episode.
A history-making. We are actually defining the narrative.
Not least the 50th episode.
The very first judgment is that of the Chief Justice Kiefel. Correct me if I'm wrong. And it's admirably clear, and you can follow it. You know, unlike this sort of tour de force that you get to later. So Kiefel was joined by two other judges in arguing not to change the law and to affirm the power of Parliament, and thus the minister to exclude non-citizens from Australia, to send them back to where they came from, as we've been doing in the thousands in recent years. And she went out of her way, it's worth a read, to say this is super important. This is it is in the absence of a relevant constitutional prohibition or exception, express or implied, it is not a proper function of a court to limit the method of exercise of legislative power. It was very, very pointed towards her fellow judges to say, don't mess with this, guys. Do not press the red button. But four of them decided to press the red button.
The other thing about Kiefel's judgment, which was a brilliant judgment, I mean, I admit it's been a few years since I've read a judgment, but Kiefel was... she pointed out the importance of it, but also the absurdity of the case that the plaintiffs in this case were trying to make. So to go way back, so the Constitution, as we all know, in Section 51 gives the Commonwealth Parliament certain powers, one of which is naturalisation and aliens, right? Aliens being non-citizens, foreigners, call them what you will. The argument that was put was that because Mabo established a body of law which recognises traditional Aboriginal law and practice as a mean and gives the Commonwealth or dictates the Commonwealth, effectively gives effect to some of those or gives property rights on the basis of those laws and customs, that Indigenous people somehow fit outside the Commonwealth's remit, that they can't be considered aliens, and therefore the Commonwealth cannot make laws concerning aliens which relate to Indigenous people, because by definition they are somehow infused
they belong.
They can't be considered aliens. So it was effectively ultra vires.
And that's the bizarre thing, that the High Court has lent into that.
Yeah.
Because the High Court often makes decisions that step well outside precedent. For example, the right to political communication. And but once it makes that decision, it really holds back. So it'll pull back, and it declines to extend it or even elaborate too much further, possibly because they're concerned if they elaborate too much further, then the idea of constitutionalism seems to fall apart. But what they've done here is that they've taken the most general claim that they could pull out of High Court jurisprudence, particularly around Mabo, and then said not that this is a general principle, but it applies to this particular circumstances of two people who do not have Australian citizenship but can make a claim to Indigenous or indigeneity Australian, that they're Aboriginal Australians. And it's that jump from that general statement, which is an interesting philosophical statement and does inform a lot of the way we think about native title, to, okay, well, in fact, that means that two people who are obviously not Australian citizens have some sort of right to Australian citizen. But we should ask Kurt how you felt when you first heard this.
Yeah, how's this going to play?
As an economist.
As someone, yeah, well, Well, as a normal person who was probably going about their daily life unaware that the High Court was about to totally upend the Constitution.
Speak on behalf of normal human Australians.
Yeah, well, exactly.
As opposed to us abnormal Australians.
I think it's interesting because it comes in the context of a broader debate around recognition and constitutional change, because this is the sort of thing that people on the conservative side have been arguing as a reason why we don't want to insert more race into the Constitution, because you'll have give the High Court powers to divide Australians by race and distinguish between categories of people based entirely on race, and this just seems quite absurd to have two categories here. We have citizens, or three categories now. So citizens, aliens, and then this third category of people based entirely on race. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in public opinion, because I think that I don't think this decision really passes the pub test. So.
Yeah, and you make a very good point, because there's been a debate about removing, led by the IPA, I might say, about removing the race power from the Constitution as incompatible with a society based on the principle that everybody should be treated equally under the law. But that's almost fallen away now, because they have said we've created this category, and again the minority judges, the three of them, I can't remember which one, but they made this point that if you do this, you are introducing race into the foundation of Australian law, quite apart from whatever the specific provision in the Constitution says. So we can remove that now, but we'll still have race.
One of the things that really struck me about this judgment was to Kurt's point, that there's a third category. And what Justice Edelman does, and Justice Edelman seems to be the strongest in the majority, so the strongest supporting the majority opinion. He comes up
the most expansive.
We'll talk about that in a sec. He comes up with this idea of a belonger. So there are citizens, and there are aliens, and then there are belongers, which are this category of people who are Aboriginal Australians but not Australian citizens, so have some collection of the rights due citizenship. Now that is, as I understand, that is a imported term from a very specific other constitutional context. So the idea of belonger comes from British overseas territories. Correct. Usually, to deal with some really complicated things about the territory, the fact that these territories, their citizenship rules are determined by the British legislature, not their local legislatures, and that Britain, once it's gotten all these colonies, doesn't want the actual inhabitants of those colonies to have British citizenship. So, but
they do want to acknowledge that they are belong to that territory that the British had conquered.
It's a fundamentally colonial concept. So it comes because of the legal complexities of dominating another people, if you will. Now, the High Court seems to have just imported, my reading of the judgment seems that the High Court's just randomly imported that as a general concept, not with any clear precedent or not with any basis on the particular context in what it means in British overseas territories. It's just said, okay, there's now a new thing called belonger. You are a belonger, and the basis of Justice Edelman seems to be you are a belonger if you have this. I'm going to quote something because I found this really strikingly, this sentence striking. I'm pretty sure it's in Edelman's thing. So he says, since settlement, Aboriginal people have been inseparably tied to the land of Australia generally, and thus to the political community of Australia, with metaphysical bonds that are far stronger than those forged by the happenstance of birth on Australian land or the nationality of parentage. That might be true, but it is not for the High Court to decide the metaphysical basis.
How can any court of law rule on metaphysics?
No, this
I mean, that is one level below the VAR.
You ask how?
Yeah, this is poetry, not High Court judgment. And
some might argue that the best judgments are poetry.
And it comes back to this, and I wish our resident expert on the nation state in Andrew Bushnell was here, because he then goes on to say this is Edelman again, thank you Christian Porter, a political community is not a thing that exists in space. It is a metaphysical construct that describes a group of people who belong to a defined place or territory, here the land of the Australian state, and who are to be regulated as such belongers. So we live in the nation state, and Australia in our British tradition. This is a Lockean state, or it's a people that have come together as a political community. Bushy would argue the political community comes first and then the constitution. If you're more social contract, it's the other way around. But in any event, we're defined by that consent of the people. Edelman's completely ignored that tradition and made up this stuff to say that it's about belonging to this place. But then this is the killer though, having said that, being in a political community is about belonging to this place, this continent, this nation that we love, Australia. He's then said, but you, none of us here, absent Indigenous heritage, which I don't think any of us are claiming, none of us belong to it quite as much as this new category of people that we have just created.
No, and
we can never belong to it as much as they do.
These are fine opinions for people to have. And if the Australian
in the
Parliament
common rooms of
wants to
universities,
make this claim, or the Australian people through a referendum want to make this claim about metaphysical bonds, that's absolutely fine. I'm not sure I'd be wrapped in it, and I might argue against it, but they can. It's not the High Court's role to make decisions about metaphysical bonds between certain people and the land.
Well said.
It's also worth pointing out that this is actually a betrayal of Mabo. It is not the continuation of Mabo. It is not a progression of it. Mabo, and again, this is sort of a very finicky legal concept, but Mabo recognised that pre-existing interests, as expressed through traditional practice and customs and so on, were recognisable by the common law as giving effect to some proprietary interest that the sovereign had not yet extinguished but could extinguish. This is totally different. This is about creating this is about recognising a parallel system of law, if you will, that sits outside the system of Australian sovereignty. And the other thing about it is, as Susan Kiefel correctly pointed out in her brilliant judgment, dissenting judgment sadly, this is applying Mabo to a native title to a completely different area of law. Native title was about property rights. It was not about migration rights.
We should probably very quickly just talk about the political consequences of this, because the High Court, of course, is a neutral arbiter of only facts, but there are going to be... this comes, as Kurt's pointed out, in the middle of a debate about recognition and the middle of a debate about the voice. Gideon, what do you think is the political significance of this, and how does this change the next couple of years of discussion?
Well, as usual, when I want to know what the punters are thinking, I go to Twitter, which I spend way too long on. So I checked it yesterday.
You're a very funny man.
I thought you were going to say the Yorkshire Stingo in Hoddle Street.
Oh, that's the...
you couldn't get there last night?
In Hoddle Street, Abbotsford, that's not the best place for a reflective pub test. But anyway, that notwithstanding, no, I jumped on Twitter, as I often do, and... after we've been responding to this, talking about how bizarre it was, outlandish, crazy, and everything else, the biggest complaint of the Twitter sphere, they were up in arms. Do you know why? Because it was a 4-3 decision. They said, how can 3 judges want to deport Indigenous people? We say that the Twitter is not real life, but this was completely upside down. As to what the political fallout of it will be, what can the Parliament do? This is a matter of constitutional interpretation. This is the final... There's no way to appeal this.
The Parliament can't do anything about this particular case, but doesn't it?
Well,
my view is that it changes quite materially the debate about recognition, doesn't it?
It's what, sorry?
It materially changes the debate about recognition.
Does it?
Yeah. Well, Ken White specifically, I thought Ken White was going down a road towards something that sounded very much like a preamble.
Yeah.
We're back to a preamble such as we saw in 96. The idea that we would recognise the prior occupation of this continent prior to European settlement. And the activists who promoted this had gone out of their way to say, but we'll make this preamble non-justiciable. It won't create new rights. And we might even write in a clause to say that the High Court is not allowed to consider this statement. But the High Court has just demonstrated that they would find a way around that.
The High Court doesn't care.
The High Court doesn't care.
And this goes to...
Yeah, or conversely, they've already done it, so what does it matter?
And look, we've been, saying thank you, Christian Porter, et cetera, and that's, this Edelman bloke, doesn't sound like the best legal mind.
So
that our country would
Edelman
have
was
thrown up.
appointed by
By
Christian
Christian
Porter.
Well,
Porter, correct. At the age of what? 30
he's
or
stunningly
something.
bright. He's clearly stunningly bright.
Yeah, okay, sure.
He's incredibly correct.
As a black-letter lawyer who will safeguard and protect the Constitution, he obviously
Not
comes up
so much.
wanting. But it also bears going into that 3 out of 4 judges in the majority in this instance were coalition appointees. And that doesn't necessarily say anything about the coalition, although I guess it does, particularly people like, I guess, George Brandis and who may have slotted in some judges that aren't the most, as I said, black-letter conservative lawyers, but it also talks to the kind of people that our law schools are producing. This is the culture in the legal profession, a profession, sadly, as I said, that I spent several years in the belly of the beast of. And I practice commercial law, let alone what they're doing down at the refugee human rights centres and all sorts of other things. But there is a culture permeating law schools of the fetishization of people like Michael Kirby and the glorification of judicial activism, this idea that you are not a judge to interpret, or you did not become a lawyer to interpret or to protect or to arbitrate the law, but you become a lawyer to make change, because the problem partly also is that law is such a boring profession. Lawyers get bored. They need to feel like, in between churning out ASIC forms and finding ways to create absurdly complex tax minimisation structures, they are actually doing something that reflects their social justice instincts. And sadly, that means coming up with crazy judgments like this.
Yeah, and when
The law should be an administration profession. That's my view.
Yeah, and I might just say final comment on it. If you do get a chance to read it, please do. And to Gideon's point, the textual analysis that you do, what distinguishes the minority from the majority judgments is the minority judgments are mainly referring to case law and previous decisions of the High Court. God forbid they're actually relying on precedent. You go to particularly Nettle and Edelman, and this is the new world of the High Court, which is they quote speeches by an Owen Dixon outside of the High Court. So not what do you call it? It's obiter. It's not even obiter because it wasn't even in the court. They quote professors of international law.
Yep.
They quote journal articles.
Correct.
One of the footnotes I saw was from a journal of post-colonial history.
Yep.
This is where the belongers stuff comes in. So you range outside what once would have been called the actual law to this realm of normative law, and you find it where you can. And
this is postmodernism.
We're in uncharted territory.
This is postmodernism and deconstructionism, worming its way into the highest court in the land. This is actually, that's the most frightening element of this. Anyway.
Right. Speaking
What can we
of
do?
speaking of going somewhere where we ain't never been before, we're about to enter a new world of digital currencies, I believe.
That's right. So on indulgence, I thought it would be fun to talk about something that I've been watching with my colleagues at RMIT for quite some time. In January, the Davos elite convention, we'll put it that way, where they bring a lot of central bankers and bureaucrats and politicians and corporate types together for a big confab to talk about the future and all that sort of thing. They made it very clear that we're entering a new age of money, and this new age of money has some really powerful and important political consequences that we should, and the Australian government should be thinking about carefully. So at Davos, they were really focusing on this idea of central bank digital currencies. And the simultaneously at the same time, corporate currencies like Libra. So the Facebook-led Libra consortium that's building out its own corporate digital currency, kind of on a blockchain, kind of a cryptocurrency. And of course, in the background, you've got cryptocurrencies there. The story behind all this, so this is all technical and interesting. And if you're interested in monetary policy and you're interested in, the nature of the financial sector, that's all, kind of interesting and all that sort of thing. But it has really significant geopolitical consequences because so much of this is driven by a dispute, not a dispute, but a competition between, on the one hand, the corporate world, so Facebook and its partners running out this corporate currency, and on the other hand, China's central bank digital currency, which it is rushing into production at the same time, and as we Sinclair Davidson, Jason Potts and I argued in the Australian Financial Review, is actually a really powerful anti-dollar hegemony technique or political mechanism where the idea is that the Chinese central government would have control over the financial system, not just of China, but of other countries that it might sort of pressure through Belt and Road to adopt the yuan and the renminbi. I thought I'd first throw to you, though, Kurt, because you've been following a lot of this for quite some time. What's your take on this new battle between multiple currencies?
Well, I think there's the number of things at play here, and I think the key issue is that the cryptos came into the world with what I think that they're great.
Just for my benefit, what's the difference between a crypto and a corporate other than who's backing it? Is it different technologically?
So it can be different technologically. There is a difference at the margin, but it can blur. But the way I think about it is there are sort of public cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. So any of us can use Bitcoin. Any of us can host a node, which is basically host the Bitcoin network on our own computer we don't have to ask anyone for permission.
Right.
A corporate digital currency, most of the models, and certainly the model that Libra is going to be using, is only a number of corporations, like 100 corporations or 100 corporations and universities or something like that, can host the network. We can all buy and sell goods with that Libra currency, but only a couple of companies or a large number of companies can be hosts. So they're not open in the same way.
Right, so it's like the difference in open source software and...
Precisely,
right,
and they've got really strong... so I'm kind of excited about corporate currencies. I'm more excited about cryptocurrencies, but I'm excited about the potential for corporate currencies to bring currency competition. But they are distinct. Sorry,
Kurt.
We'll go back to Kurt.
So what I think the two great features of something like of Bitcoin and cryptos based on blockchain is that they have privacy and also a decentralized approach to the money. So there's no one entity that's controlling, has the ability to print the money, because I think it was Rothbard who said that the great law is that if an entity has the ability to print money, they will. It's just a truism. So I think those are the two great ideals of Bitcoin, and I think these other things, like with the corporate coins and clearly like the central bank move into digital currency, completely undermine those two benefits. So I think that the huge battle at the moment is really over the control of money, and the central banks around the world do not want to lose that control, and because that's the basis of using monetary policy to meddle in the economy, to affect that's their whole reason for existing, is that they control the money supply. So I think that's a key part of this, and if they lose that ability to, whether it be to other countries or to corporate coins, I think that's it's game over for them. So that's a key reason for that. But the other thing that's concerning about some of the developments here is China's role in all this, because they have extreme market power in some of these things with, say, like WeChat payments and things like that. If they can get control of the way that people, like billions of people, transact, then that undermines completely privacy concerns.
Yeah, it'll obviously become a tool of surveillance.
Exactly. So it has you're being surveilled by the CCP, for example. That's not an outcome that anyone wants. But at the moment, they have extreme abilities to do that because of the nature of their political setup.
So can I just ask you something, Chris? And by the way, whenever I have to know about monetary policy, I get Kurt to explain it to me. So I'm not going to contribute anything. I just want to ask a few dumb questions. But one thing that stood out... That
is a contribution. Don't be down on yourself.
Thank you. You always make me feel so good about myself and my intellectual prowess, Chris. But... and congratulations on the piece. It was a very good article. But one thing that stood out is you said that the Australian government is trying to create its own digital currency. Now, that to me is horrifying, because as we all know, what will happen is, firstly, ASIO will want to see who's using the currency, then the AFP will want it, then the ATO will want it, and then it becomes a matter of, if your GP sees that you've spent too much money on Big Macs or something, you don't become entitled to a Medicare benefit or some goddamn thing. I mean, What are the possibilities for this?
So that's right. And the RBA has been a bit cagey about its investigations into digital currency. It's experimenting with. It's not necessarily
like their Manhattan
building.
project.
Yeah, sort of. So they're experimenting with it. They're not building it out. And to my mind, that is a big part of this story. And Kurt mentioned the privacy thing. We've got to look at this in the context of a simultaneous digitization of the economy, and don't doubt that the ATO can track any digital payment you make and knows what money goes into your bank and what money doesn't, and where it goes afterwards. So they've got incredibly powerful surveillance tools already. So to that extent, it's not a huge jump. It might make some efficiency gains. It might make some surveillance, open up some new surveillance opportunities. But by and large, for a country like Australia, a central bank digital currency, if we get one in the near term, is not going to be a huge change. What is, however, simultaneously happening, and I know, Kurt, again, you've been looking at this too, is the government and a lot of governments around the world have also been saying, well, now we've got to start getting rid of cash. Because unlike digital currency, unlike fully central bank digital currencies or just the digitization of economic exchange, we don't know what you do with the money that you have in your wallet, and we can't track each individual dollar as it passes from merchant to merchant, or is spent on drugs or assassinations or whatever they think that we're spending our money on. So the Australian government has decided that it wants to ban the $10,000 cash transactions as well. And Kurt, there's been a big backlash about that in the last week or two, particularly from in the coalition.
Yeah, there has been, and there's been quite a wide public backlash about this. I've seen drummed up a lot on Twitter, and a lot of the punters out there are quite concerned about this. People are very attached to using cash, and they see that this is being threatened. And I think that it comes at an interesting time where the central banks are talking about negative interest rates, which, if that flowed through to your bank account, instead of you earning interest on your account, you'd actually be charged to hold your money in the bank. And so this is part of a scheme, a broader scheme to get people to spend in some sort of stimulus approach, to say, okay, I need to spend money because it's eroding in my bank account.
Yeah, which is insane. And so many of these people who argue for these negative interest rates, just like you ask them, well, but won't people just take money out of the bank? So they say, like, oh no, we should ban cash then.
Cash.
That's the fundamental solution. Oh, well, we'll ban cash.
I think it's
You'll have to put it in the bank.
It's quite funny that the RBA has actually come out and denied the conspiracy, which it's interesting that they've been driven that far to actually have to come out and deny it. But I mean, it's a huge coincidence that at the same time we're talking about negative interest rates, and the big problem of negative interest rates is that people
don't like to pay negative interest rates.
Well, withdraw from the banking system, and at the same time we're pushing forward with removing that ability.
Yeah, they've got nothing to do with each other.
I mean, how
dare you make such claims?
I don't. Please, either of you jump in here. But the other thing I'd like to disentangle from the RBA's point of view is one of the criticisms of these digital currencies is that is advanced by the central bankers, is that a proliferation of digital currencies might lead to some kind of macroeconomic instability. And I'm sort of thinking, like, yeah, because you guys did such a good job of that.
How much worse could it possibly be?
Is that a thing?
Yeah, look, so the way I think about this is we are coming into historically uncharted territory. If you think about it this way, in 1911, the Australian Central Bank, the Commonwealth Bank at the time, took over the note issue in Australia. And ever since then, for more than 100 years, we have had one single Australian currency that the Australian public uses for all its transactions by law. Some small currency traders held some foreign exchange, but by and large, we all used Australian dollars.
What do you mean by law?
Technically by tax. So
right.
The Australian government taxed private issuance of currency and made it uneconomical.
Is that still on the books today?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking, Gideon.
You'll take it on notice.
I'll take it on notice.
Can we find
I'm not precisely sure exactly what the legal situation is. But anyway, there's an Australian dollar. Now, or at least ever since the invention of Bitcoin, and now there'll be Libra and there'll be all these central bank digital currencies and the proliferation of cryptocurrencies, we can effortlessly hold dozens and dozens of different currencies. And as things like Libra get adopted, as cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, their adoption increases, then we're going to suddenly see ourselves in a world of massive currency competition. This is the sort of stuff that Friedrich Hayek was hypothesizing about in his denationalization of money, where free bankers have argued a niche community in a already niche community of free marketeers have argued about for decades and decades. It's on us now. And so when we see these three categories of new digital currency, this is the significance of that from the perspective of the global financial system, the global economic system, is really hard to underestimate. And the parallel we drew in the op-ed was all the changes that happened with the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the way that changed the economic system, all the changes that happened when Richard Nixon abandoned Bretton Woods. We're doing that again. Super exciting.
So what do you think casting your mind ahead 10 years to when this has really come into vogue, cryptocurrencies and corporate currencies and so on, what do you think the response from the Australian government will be? Will they try to ban it? Will they tax it? Will they...
Look,
it'll be the same old thing. It'll be the RBA protecting its own interests.
Yeah, so there's a number of countries that have actually quite aggressively tried to push away. In fact, my favourite is the Bank of France. Mm-hmm. The Bank of France chief declared last month that currency cannot be private. Money is a public good of sovereignty. And they've warned that Libra is not welcome in Europe and that sort of thing. In fact, it's actually our job to answer that question. The Australian government has given us a Australian Research Council grant to look into the ways that the Australian government should respond to cryptocurrencies and whatnot. So it depends on how well I do my job.
Yeah.
It is the answer to that question.
Yeah, we'll never get any criticism.
The future of currency competition is in your hands.
It is.
And we'll never get any criticism of the ARC out of...
No.
Never said a bad word about those ARC grants.
They always pick great projects, I've always said.
Now, speaking of industries that always prefer to deal in cash, we turn to the hospitality industry, and everyone thinks this is about George Calombaris, but he is the public face of the Maid Group. He's a 20% shareholder, and it has gone into liquidation. The former MasterChef star and 400 employees out of work. Some of them may continue if the liquidator is able to establish any of the business units of that restaurant, that series of restaurants, as viable entities in coming days. But otherwise, it's curtains for that. And Chris, what does all this mean? So
keen listeners will remember that we discussed the ruling that Fair Work made, or the enforceable undertaking it imposed on George Calombaris Maid Establishment Restaurant Group in July. Of course, George Calombaris was the owner of the Press Club, Hellenic Republic, and Jimmy Grant's, famous Australian celebrity chef and Melbourne icon. Apparently, he's now thinking of returning. Or leaving and moving to Greece after this. Anyway, so he was found to have underpaid $7.8 million in wages and superannuation to 500 of his employees. He'd failed to pay minimum rates of pay, casual loadings, various things like that, penalty rates, all this sort of stuff. And he has now become the icon of the union's campaign against what they describe as wage theft. Gideon, I'll ask you first, what do you think we've learnt out of the Calombaris episode?
To be brutally honest, I think we've learned something that I knew already, which is we can't have nice things in this country. We can't have... And that's a serious point. I mean... I think when I was on that original discussion you had, and you draw a very important distinction, which I'd never thought of before. There are two kinds of wage theft, to use that terribly loaded term. if you agree with somebody to pay them a certain amount and you cheat them out of that agreed amount, that is obviously wrong, and we need to call that out. However,
And that is outright theft.
that is outright theft.
Yeah.
No bones about it. If you reach an agreement with somebody who wants to be a barista or a chef or a waiter or whatever else, and you can't afford to pay them whatever the award is, which I'll get to in a second, and that you agree to pay them under the table a certain amount, it may be illegal, but I don't think it's necessarily immoral. It is a voluntary exchange between two people. Now, I looked into the topic of wage theft a little while ago, and I did some research on it, which I never got around to publishing. But underpayment is extremely prevalent in the food and hospitality sector. According to the Fair Work Ombudsman, almost 50% of the sector underpays, right? According to Unions New South Wales, they did a bit of research on...
Underpays against the minimum wage.
Against the minimum wage. Against the minimum wage, not against what was agreed, because it would be hard to determine statistics on that. But Unions New South Wales found that 97% of hospitality job ads online on Facebook and websites and things like that had offered wages below the award. And I looked at a bit other industries where underpayment is common, and the data suggests that there are three common attributes among sectors that overpay. Number one is that they have lower than average profitability, so they run on tighter margins, which makes obvious sense. Secondly, a higher than average number of workers employed in small business, that is businesses that don't have the economies of scale to do lucrative EBAs with and sweetheart deals with unions. And thirdly, and following on from that, as I said, a greater than average reliance on awards. So this is a problem with the awards system. Now, people are dancing on George Calombaris' grave and say, oh, it's fantastic, we got him, blah, 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 celebrating the fact that 200 people are now out of work, fantastic, well done, trade union movement. But also, but if these hipsters clapping their tongue over this think that their favourite cafe or dumpling joint in inner city Melbourne is not doing exactly the same thing, they have rocks in their head. You cannot have a plate of dumplings for $8 and pay the bloke bringing it to you $35 an hour on weekends. It makes absolutely no economic sense. And when they start chucking people in jail for wage theft because they want to make it a criminal offence, well, that you will see the death of the hospitality industry in this country. God help us all when Deliveroo, for example, has to pay a $35 delivery fee because it is unsustainable to have the business model that has allowed the system to survive up until now. So, look, things are going to get really, really bad, and I think it's very sad for the country.
Kurt, how much do you pay for your dumplings?
Well, I definitely won't be buying dumplings if I have to pay
$50 a plate.
$35 delivery fee. But I think it's important to look at the broader context here. Is like in 2019, there's a number of big corporates that were had issues with underpaying. And that includes Qantas,
Woolworths,
the super retail group that has Rebel Sport, super cheap auto, the Commonwealth Bank, Michael Hill, Bunnings, and Woolworths. And let's not forget the ABC.
The ABC.
And it's interesting. Every time we see an article about underpaying, it's always wage theft. But the ABC is it's a mistake. It's a mistake. It's underpaying, which of course it is. It's ABC.
It's not their money. What do they care?
Well, exactly. They're not deliberately trying to underpay. It really speaks to the complexity of our industrial system. And these are the big players who have plenty of resources to deal with these things and to work out the different awards and in the interaction with penalty rates and all these things, and to do the right thing. And as Gideon was talking about, who this is really affecting is the small guys, the small businesses who don't have the resources to look at these complexities. They don't, frankly, have the time to go through these things. They're trying to run a business instead of looking at all the interactions of the complex system. The other issue is that, and I've heard people say this, that they contact Fair Work, and depending on who they get conflicting information on what they're supposed to do. And this
is that right?
To very basic things like the Australia Day holiday that fell on Sunday. Is that do we pay public holiday rates, or where's the public holiday? Like very basic things like that, and you have conflicting advice. So it's actually impossible for many business owners to actually comply with this thing. So I think that's really where the debate around this should go is, I think, to push back a little bit, I think that if you're going to have minimum wages and an award system, you need to enforce it.
Yeah.
And
Well, yeah.
I disagree with having the award system, but if you're going to have it, you can't allow some people who are more willing to go into grey areas to take advantage of that. But what we should be concentrating on is having a clear system where it's easy to comply with. Everything's can easily be above board, and people can comply without fear of being dragged before Fair Work.
And to clarify, I'm not condoning breaking the law, but what I am saying is that if you don't, you won't be able to open up a shop.
It's the combination of the system that we have, and there's plenty of research out of the US, by the way, where they can track the effect of minimum wages on restaurant closures. And I think a dollar of a minimum wage increase is like a 10% increase in the exit rates out of the industry. I just wanted to say, by the way, putting on my IPA corporate hat, that as a lot of this relates
You'll have to take off the headphones first.
There you go. But then I wouldn't be able to hear you so clearly, Chris. George Calombaris has been, Charles Peer pointed this out in the great magazine, The Spectator Australia, yesterday, that the unions have had it in for Calombaris for nearly 10 years now, ever since he first called out the pernicious effect of penalty rates in the hospitality industry, and put a big target on his back, I think was the expression. And so George was under attack 10 years ago. And who was it that backed him? In a story that I found online, it says, Institute of Public Affairs Work Reform Director John Lloyd said Mr. Shorten and the union should be listening to Mr. Calombaris's concerns, because he joined a growing list of restaurant owners warning penalty rates could cause restaurant closures and job losses. So the great John Lloyd, former Public Service Commissioner and many other senior appointments, was calling this out a long time ago, that this is unsustainable. The hospitality industry is in dire straits. The only ones left will be the corporates. I mean, nobody's got any damn money anyway, because they're too busy just trying to scratch out their power bills and the childcare fees and try and buy a house and every other thing. So there's a massive squeeze going on here, and it was only that Calombaris had made himself a target and could be the public face of the MAID group. And Innes Wilcox from the employee groups has been very, very unusually strong on this, I'd say, pointing all this out. And the union's defence is, it was nothing to do with us. He got what he deserved. It was only because there was a customer boycott. Well, who whipped up the frenzy? Who actually whipped up the frenzy? And he's not even, he's a 20% director. He wasn't even the majority.
Yeah.
He wasn't even a director of this thing, but it was a convenient target for the unions to go after him.
The other side effect of all this, which bears going into, and this is ironically something the unions do talk about a lot, which is the exploitation of migrant workers. The workaround for a lot of restaurants, in particular, is over-reliance on, there's reliance on 457s, and there are people and things like that, and there are people who debate that. But in particular, international students are great people to have working under the table, because typically they exceed the maximum number of hours they're permitted to work. So if they blab, you can counter blab on them and send them home. Yeah. And as a result, they are put in situations which are unsafe, which they are overworked, they are paid genuinely low rates of pay. We have created this black market in human labour.
One of the other so that's one downstream consequence. Another downstream consequence is that the labour market is actually responding to this high minimum wage, and I can't help but see a close relationship between high and complex industrial relations laws and the gig economy. So a lot of people drop out of full-time employment or drop out of single company employment and move into gig economy type employment, because in the gig economy, minimum wages, all that sort of stuff does not apply. Now, a lot of people enjoy driving for Uber. A lot of people don't enjoy driving for Uber, but do it anyway. But regardless, what they've done is they've made a decision to actually go into effectively self-employment aided by technological change that allows them to get jobs where they may not have been able to get jobs, and avoid some of the really high constraints of the industrial relations system.
Yeah, and there's hundreds of thousands of people around Australia voting with their feet, essentially, in the gig economy, making those choices, and
that's not always desirable, because a lot of those people might want more stable employment. They might want to have an employer who makes a lot of the accounting decisions and all that sort of for them. But because of our industrial relations system, many people have been excluded from that decision.
Yeah, because people complain about, these Uber drivers are making less than the minimum wage. But what the actual problem is that there is no, at that pay rate around the minimum wage or just below it, there's no legal employment structure for them to be employed, and so there's no competition. So, which actually puts downward pressure on the rates that Uber drivers get, because these people who, if they're out of work and they're around that pay rate, are forced to go into self-employment instead of being employed, which it's not a good result for anybody by closing down the competition.
I feel like all of the topics we've covered today, all three of them, are not just the High Court, but the outworking of what's happening with our industrial relations system and digital currencies are all issues that we will revisit in future episodes.
They're weighty issues. I think we've done weighty issues.
They are weighty and
developing
developing
me out a bit,
issues.
actually, this program.
Well,
digital currency I'm excited for.
Thank you for joining us on our 50th anniversary.
Then what we should do is move to our books and culture segment and just start talking about, let's start with the frothy one.
Favourite things.
I've been watching television.
Yeah,
Scott.
let's talk about television.
I've been
We're the
watching
only thing to do in this country when the unions close down all the restaurants.
American television.
And the bars. Oh, God, the bars. Oh, okay.
All right. So I've been watching.
antidepressant.
When you get home from the bar, Gideon, you should put on Secession, which is a black comedy about a media mogul and his children. And obviously they're thinking about secession planning. It's not quite meant to be Rupert Murdoch, but it's pretty close. It's not the biggest company in the world, or biggest media company in the world, but it's like the fourth biggest media company in the world. There's obviously the whole thing is about jostling for who's going to be the successor. And when the old man is going to step down. It's actually, so you watch it and over time you realise that it's one of the funniest shows you've ever seen, but it reads like a drama. And it's a soap opera. It's sort of soap opera format, very high quality, golden age of television style drama, but it is just really, really good. As Scott was saying, everybody says that they're obsessed with this. I am now obsessed with this because everybody told me that they should watch it. I think the key thing to know is, and I only realised this after I started watching it, is it's been written and produced by one of the person in charge of the funniest stuff on television in the last 2 decades. The guy's name is Jesse Armstrong. He's the writer of Veep, The Thick of It, Peep Show, and In the Loop. So if you like any of those, all of them, almost all of them are political dramas, easily the best political dramas and political comedies done in the last 2 decades, and then Peep Show, which is just an amazing show. If you like any of them, but you want it to be even darker and even angrier and look more like a drama, you should watch Secession.
It's a comedy.
It's a comedy. It's not obviously a comedy, but once you realise it's a comedy, it'll become your favourite show on television at the moment anyway.
Starts to open up. Great. Now, Gideon, you've been looking at a classic work.
Yeah, so, and this is really almost embarrassing to come on this show as this is what you're reading at the moment. I mean, especially for the director of policy at the IPA, but Milton Friedman, Capitalism and Freedom, classic. I have quoted from it, I've cited it, I've sent around memes about it and everything else, but I've never read the bloody thing. So finally, after 32 years, I'm sitting down and reading it. Unsurprisingly, it is engrossing. It jumps off the page. It is extremely relevant still to the debates we are having in the year 2020. But interestingly enough, I'm not that far in just yet, but the chapter I read last night was the chapter of, very relevantly, the control of money. And it was interesting to see Friedman's take, decades and decades and decades ago, before any of the technology that we've been talking about today was even contemplated, and he argues against the two polar extremes of what was then monetary policy. The one end you had the gold standard, which for various and somewhat obvious reasons became unworkable and so on. at least in a pure form, and on the other was the central banking, reserve banking, and he illustrated how the bad decisions of the Federal Reserve in the US not only exacerbated but in a lot of ways caused the Great Depression, and Friedman's solution is for, rather than giving money of laws, not money of men, rather than giving a small cadre of central bankers control over the money supply, he suggests prescribing some sort of flat rule which is predictable, understood and everything else. He settles on the rule of increasing the money supply by 3 to 5% a year for reasons that Kurt, I'm sure, will be able to explain to me. But interestingly enough, this is the juncture we find ourselves at now. We find ourselves, there's the competition element, but also the fact that Bitcoin and these currencies are extremely predictable and reliable in how they internally govern themselves. That's what the blockchain technology has enabled. So we are seeing Friedman's conception of monetary policy come alive now in the 21st century. It's very interesting.
It is super interesting. And Friedman was writing at a time where the alternative to the gold standard, as many people saw it, was just unfettered central bank discretion. And I'm not critical of Friedman's analysis because the idea of having fixed rules in any currency is the right choice. Now, my view is that mine, like Kurt's, would be much more Austrian, and obviously currency competition is the goal. But fundamentally, if you're going to have a central bank and working within the political system that certainly he experienced when he was writing these arguments in the 60s and the 80s, you better have it fixed. And you're absolutely right. What's cool and exciting, one of the exciting things about these cryptocurrencies and potentially corporate currencies is that they fix the inflation rate. In fact, we know precisely when we know precisely how much Bitcoin is going to be released into the wild.
Is that because it relies on people mining it, or
no? So it's built into the protocol itself.
Is that right?
So every 10 minutes, it will, on average, it will release a certain amount of Bitcoin to a successful miner.
Really?
And we know precisely when that amount is going to change as well. In fact, it's going to what's called the halvening is going to happen in May, where it goes from 12.5 to 6.75 or whatever it is. So what we've moved into is this environment where these currencies are really fixed. Now, it's also a really important thing right now because the RBA cannot hit its inflation targets.
No.
Can it, Kurt?
Yeah, that's right.
No. It's completely incapable of doing its only job.
The other thing about Friedman, good on you for reading Friedman. I mean, what a great popularizer of capitalism he was, and we shouldn't underestimate when he wrote that book. So early 60s, and his monetary policy work. You know, he was an outlier. He was a complete outlier.
And he would be by today's standards too.
I mean, it was so Keynesian that he was just seen as a lunatic. Monetarism was called voodoo economics, and not just by the left.
Like George H.W. Bush eventually.
Yeah, exactly. The Austrians didn't like it either because it didn't fit their model. He stuck to his guns. His reading of the Great Depression was radical, then got popularised by Amity Schleys in The Forgotten Man, and is now much, much more accepted that FDR made the recession worse. And bugger, of course, George Bush Sr. lost to Ronald Reagan, who actually believed it and implemented it, created that squeeze with Greenspan in the early 80s. Everyone around him was panicking, and Reagan said, no, we have to do it. If not us, who? If not now, when? They did it, and by the time he got to the 84 election, it was morning in America. So, God damn it, everything Friedman said they should do, they did, and it worked. And so no wonder that he's revered as a hero of freedom and capitalism. But there are others in that liberal tradition, Kurt.
Yeah, so I've been reading...
You're getting better and better at segues.
Doing my best.
Another 20th century economist, Wilhelm Ropke. This is a reader called the Humane Economist, which is a play on one of his famous works, The Humane Economy. Ropke was a student of Mises and sort of that Austrian school, but he sort of moved away and sort of furthered in a different direction. He's also quite influential on Ludwig Erhard, who was the economics minister in Germany after World War II, who was instrumental in the German economic miracle, where all the advice was coming in from the West to have tight controls on prices and have a fixed economy, and he just overnight said, "Nah, we're just announced that that the prices we're ending the price controls." Everyone panicked, but it turned out to lead to one of the great economic booms. So that's an interesting background on Ropke. But I think some of the interesting things that Ropke talks about, and one of these great themes, is really looking at the market and the role that the prerequisites for the market play. So these would be like the moral, ethical foundations of the market economy, which is really a broader thing. So he talks about a lot of the errors of just economism, just looking at markets and ignoring the broader social framework in which markets actually work. And to this, he has two main things that he attacks, and one of those is what he calls the social rationalists, who think that we can separate the institutional framework of which markets have historically flourished and just use the markets in a certain way which destroys the unity between these two things. And so you see that in the folly of trying to put markets in context where there is no respect for the rule of law or for an ethical system as we have in the West, influenced by Christianity. Another key theme in Ropke is the role of Christianity in this broader social edifice that really backs up the market. And one of the interesting things is when he talks about communism, and this is before the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, and he talks about how we can't fight communism with just the materialistic approach of saying, markets lead to better material living standards, which of course is true, and he acknowledges that is the case. But he says that we need to actually argue that our ethical and moral principles are superior to the communists. And I think that's an interesting sort of foresight, as a lot of people in the early 90s were very hopeful that we'd destroyed communism because we'd once and for all proved that the West had far greater living standards than the Soviet Union. But I think one of the interesting things where communism is sort of coming back is I think that we've failed to actually instill in the public this idea of our moral values and to have meaning. And I think this will sort of tie into Scott's pick a little bit, where now people who are sort of grasping for meaning, and they've turned back to communism, which we thought we had beaten. But I think Ropke's insight really speaks to the issues here. It's really a battle between two value systems as opposed to just dry, narrow economic considerations. That's
right, and it reminds me of Deirdre McCloskey's argument about the virtues and ethical systems underlying liberalism, that it's not that the liberal values get you just richer economies, although that's super important, but it's also just a better virtue system. It's a more respectful virtue system. It's a virtue system that allows people to flourish in whatever domains they choose.
And one of the things I think it might be a difference with McCloskey is that he talks about that these prerequisites must be furnished from outside the market. So there's a little bit of skepticism that the market will generate the virtues necessary to keep the system going. And I think that's a pretty interesting insight there, that that he sort of speaks in a way that a lot of free marketers haven't, in ways of the dangers of a purely market system detached from the broader moral.
Yeah, it means that you have to
system.
Pay some attention to the institutions of society as well, and you need, the market must drive economic exchange, but it doesn't mean that you can leave society to the market.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's one of his key themes.
Is this? I mean, this sounds to me dangerously close to the sort of national conservatism that's coming into vogue. Is it? That I mean, the rejection of the market, or at least the reconsideration of hearing the Tucker Carlsons of the world.
I don't know. I see this a lot more in the. I mean, Adam Smith, and the book that Adam Smith is most famous for is The Wealth of Nations. But The Theory of Moral Sentiments is the book that underlines the philosophical structure of The Wealth of Nations, and that's about the way we relate to each other outside a market context, and that's arguably what Smith was more interested in. So those moral presuppositions that allow us to act in an economy. We are people first and economic agents second. Economics doesn't always focus on the first, but it needs to. And I think that's what McCloskey and obviously Ropke are actually urging us to do. We have to have a holistic view about the structures of the market.
And you're right to an extent, maybe not national conservatism, but I think probably it supported that German tradition of ordo-liberalism, the belief that yes, the state did need to actually have some key institutions
what, the courts?
Things like, say they supported competition law. To regulate in the belief that shame. I know, but
not hearing anything.
But the connection is essentially that freedom had to be. In order to preserve freedom, it was necessary to create some institutions which would give it some legitimacy to a wider constituency. And it's, I think the modern equivalent would be what Tyler Cowen's calling state capacity libertarianism. And probably this might have horrified Ropke to have gone to that extent. I don't think Ropke is in any way that sort of national conservative. But
I think I'm projecting.
But the Freiburg school, the Germans, I think do in a way that a hardcore libertarian would not admit that there isn't a role for the state in some of the institutions in order to preserve the capitalist system.
And that is that German tradition of ordo-liberalism, they call it.
Yep. What I will say is that I have noticed over the last couple of decades or so the co-option of economics and the market by the left to as a sort of Trojan horse for their own. How many times have you heard
renewable energy, blah blah blah? It's a market.
It's
system,
a market
blah,
mechanism,
blah, blah,
or some bozo on the 7:30 report saying if we just taxed alcohol a little bit more, then you can see the market will sort out the bring down health costs and so on. I mean, it is
nudge.
It is a bastardisation. I think that actually goes to the fact that ironically, the cultural left tend to be the materialist ones. There's no problem that can't be solved by flinging some more money at it.
I think it was tactical. They realised they'd lost the argument on central planning, so they said, okay, it's about markets then.
And we'll centrally plan the markets.
They don't actually believe in them. That's right. They just use them as a tactic to beat conservatives over their head.
And we let them.
So I am going to close with a very, very fresh essay from the March 2020 edition of the Atlantic Monthly, which I must say is not bad. It's not as the Atlantic
magazine or
the magazine. I think it's not as crazy as things like
they've got a number of really good writers there.
And so David Brooks, who his day job is the tame conservative for the New York Times, author of some great books, but he is a conservative, and what he's looking at here, you've got the provocative title, "The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake." And the subtitle is
cool.
The family, not for the reasons you think.
Does that speak to you, Gideon?
I think in the sense of not in contradistinction to Lone Ranger, but in fact to wider ties of kinship and supportive networks, I think is what he's contrasting with. He said, the subtitle is, "The family structure we've held up as a cultural idea for the past half century has been a catastrophe for many. It is time to figure out better ways to live together." And so this is not necessarily endorsing all of this, but he certainly put his spotlight on a lot of social issues. They're as always in America, they're at their most extreme in America, but they're not unfamiliar to us here in Australia. And what he's saying is that as we modernised, as we created a modern market economy, it was all about people coming away from their ties to traditional society, coming out of their household production units, off their farms, dad teaching the boys how to work the carpentry tools, or mum teaching the daughters how to sew, and we moved into factories, and the family unit that adapted to enable that was the nuclear family. And for a while there, essentially, he's saying is this worked pretty well. The nuclear family thrived. We had affordable housing. Cost of living was reducing all the time. And it was enabled also by the fact that the gender division of labour, with women looking after the household, meant the family unit got the attention that it needed. Now, and I'm adumbrating a long essay, but he's essentially saying that model of the success of the nuclear family is now something only rich people can achieve. That marriage rates are still high amongst the most educated and the most wealthy. Everywhere else, it's a story of the collapse of the nuclear family, children being raised particularly without father figures in their households, with all the social pathologies. That's created. As I say, he's conservative, but not necessarily a darling of the conservative movement, because he is bipartisan in his criticisms. He's saying the conservative movement in America believes in the family correctly, but then essentially just looks down on the lower classes, which are unable to maintain stable family units. Brooks wants to understand why that is the case. And the left, of course, the progressives are still celebrating, just pushing individualism to its extreme. Reminds me of those conservatives who conflate liberalism and libertinism. He's saying they have a point. The progressives just see this as an unalloyed good that you have ripped yourself away from these traditional moorings. And what he is harking back to is the age of extended families, of grandparents, of uncles, of aunties, of big households, like you still sometimes see in ethnic communities or neighbourhood communities. The kids that are sort of, he wouldn't have said neighbours, but I do. But the idea that the kids are in and out of the different parents' houses in the cul-de-sac, and so for instance we all note the stat of children staying longer in their parents' households. And it's like, isn't this a disaster? Brooks is like, well,
yeah, great.
is that a disaster? Is it actually really that different generations are cohabiting in this house and living their lives and in the workforce and perhaps even starting families? Grandma and grandpa come back. What's wrong with that? So it's a really provocative essay, I think.
It's like Bowling Alone for families. Is that the
something like that? And it does adopt the critique of neoliberalism that by the atomisation of the individual and the destruction of the family has been an outgrowth of capitalism. I don't agree with that.
Let me make one argument in the defence of the nuclear family, insofar as or the ideal of it is that those extended family networks for many people can also be very suffocating as well, and they prevent. And you see this in a lot of particularly migrant communities. They can be suffocating that prevent people from actually being able to pursue their own lives. You see this in a lot of traditional societies as well, and it does hold back really significant living standard increase. So I take, and I look forward to reading the essay, but I take that critique as quite significant, but you've also always got to compare it to, well, what were people pushing away from in the first place?
Look, conversations like this, and this is something we talk about around the water cooler in this place all the time.
The nature of the family.
Firstly, I'd reject. Yeah, I'm sympathetic, and I love my family very much. But in my observation, Chris, you're right. I think families are like airbags.
They believe in marriage.
They save.
Big supporter of marriage.
I say us Rosners, we believe in marriage. Very much. My father had 3 of them. My mother's on her 2nd, so we're big believers in the institution of marriage. Look, firstly, I reject the idea that the left has pushed, and we hear this again from the National Conservative types, not that I'm accusing you of that particularly noxious ideology, but we do hear this, we've pushed individual to its extreme, the left have pushed individualism at all costs. No, the left haven't pushed individualism, they hate individualism. They have pushed collectivism, alienation from family in favour of the collective and also in favour of the state. They're the ones who are using schools as a mechanism for social engineering, not genuine education. But secondly, this idea of the collapsing family and everything else, I mean, the nature of the family is changing and nobody can afford to have a family on one income anymore. Who the hell can afford that? But for reasons I don't particularly understand a lot of the time, people are still on their own and in the absence of government encouragement, getting married, having kids, scrimping and saving to buy a criminally expensive house in the suburbs, paying through the nose for school fees because our public schools fill their heads with garbage. I mean, it's not easy to achieve a nuclear family. It certainly isn't, but people are doing it. The problem is, and this is part of the reason I've delayed or indeed may not end up getting married and having kids, because I can't afford a mortgage and school fees either without compromising my lifestyle. Who wants to do that? The problem is that we have made it unaffordable, as you said, for working people to achieve really what is something that is an extension of human nature and a very natural way of being.
But I think there's a broader changes that I think Brooks outlines, and I think draws on a theme in a lot of conservative thought, which is that the idea, and I think that the left has pushed individualism, and I think that
on the margin, just to clear that point, they've pushed individualism so far as if you think that you're, aquagender or whatever it is, then that's your individualism.
Well, that's radical individualism.
Sure, but that's around the margins. But in terms of where you can work, where you can live, how much of your own money you get to keep, how much you can drink, how much you can smoke, how much how you deal with your employees and how you deal with your business and your private property, all those things are vested in the state. So it is a furphy, I think.
As you were saying,
sorry, Kurt.
It's sort of a paradoxically, as this push towards this form of individualism, it's actually just resulted in people being completely atomized and completely naked before the state.
No,
so
that's
the
true.
only institutions, you have individuals and the state, and this is what you're talking about. Is really the state being involved in all of these intermediary institutions that have completely lost their function in society. And I think that one of the issues for the family is that as well as the family being attacked by the state, is that the state has attacked all of these intermediary institutions like the neighbourhood communities and sporting clubs and all these things.
Absolutely.
That the nuclear family has to take on a role which it never had, like has a certain people are expecting to get things from the family that they would have got from a broader community, but also it's becoming increasingly the case that the family just doesn't do the things that it used to do. So 100 years ago, people, economics and everything was very tied to the family. You had a lot more small business, a lot more family business where people were dependent on each other economically. You had education being more in the home. You had aged care being taken care of by people in the home. You'd look after your parents instead of having that taken care of by other institutions, state institutions. Yeah. So I think that there's a number, and these things sort of fostered the relationships and the strength of the family. And I think it is a concerning trend where we're moving towards the family just becoming what some people have called just like a loading dock where you go home at night and recharge and
like the Borg, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's
the people you watch television with.
And that conception of family, I think, is really is a complete degradation of what family should
points.
be.
Yeah, no,
very legitimate points, particularly about civil society as well, which is a big piece missing here.
Yeah, so I think all of these things are sort of interacting to create
and I think it's the right time to have a reckoning, and there will be policy consequences from this as well, although that's not what's driving Brooks, but it is worth thinking about in policy terms. You have been listening to Looking Forward, which is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. If you want to find out more, go to ipa.org.au. You can look at our other great podcasts, our great research, all sorts of terrific videos are described there. You can read Morgan Begg's terrific media release on the disgraceful High Court decision from yesterday, or the disgraceful High Court majority decision, I should say, and lots of other good stuff as well. A big thank you to our panels today, Dr. Chris Berg.
Thanks, Scott.
Kurt Wallace.
Thank you.
Gideon Rozner.
Thank you.
And also our wonderful producer, Josh Stranger.
Yeah.
I'm Scott Hargreaves, and we'll be back with more looking forward next week.